欢迎来到分论坛国际测评现状和未来。有请嘉宾上台。Welcome to the Global Assessment Current and Future Subforum. Let's welcome our speakers onto the stage.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for being here with us. Today, I'm very honored to be the panel moderator for this session. My name is Joy, and I'm here on the stage with three phenomenal experts with extensive experience in assessment. Before we get started, I would like to give the floor to them to have them give us a very quick self-introduction. Shall I start from my very left side?
Hello, my name is Bob Locke. I am the Vice President of Corporate Development at ACT, an American testing company. In that role, I am responsible for the mergers and acquisitions for the organization. I also run our social and emotional learning business. That's SEL, or social skills, soft skill programs for U.S. schools. Before I joined ACT, I spent 5 years as CEO of Professional Examination Service, which is a nonprofit in New York City that managed testing programs for large credentialing organizations like Project Management Institute and the CFA. And prior to that, I spent 7 years at ETS, Educational Testing Service. So essentially, I've been in the testing business for about 15 years.
My name is Daniel Schwartz. I've been studying how people learn for quite a long time. I taught school teenagers for about 10 years, and then I went and got a degree. Now I'm the Dean of the Graduate School of Education. So I do want to say one thing about assessment, that there's lots of distinctions about who are we assessing, why are we assessing it. I think an important distinction is assessing what people have already accomplished versus assessing what we think they will be able to accomplish. I think this is an important theme here.
So I'm Carl Wyman. I'll start out by saying a bunch of things Dan left out that he's done. He's written a book on assessment. He does a lot of studies in detail about how to learn different ways people are thinking and can be accomplished. And I mention that in particular because I use a lot of that in my own work. I have a background in physics, but I also have a background for 30 years in actually measuring teaching and learning, particularly of science, and focusing on the expert thinking, how good scientists, good physicists, how they think and solve problems. And in the last few years, we've been particularly focusing on better ways to measure that. So everything I think about doing and talking about with assessment, it's really probing the extent to which people assessing students are learning that, how different ways of teaching are better or worse for accomplishing that. And two of the major aspects of that I've been working with is using interactive simulations where the student can interact and ask questions and work in trying to do much more things than a traditional instructional media allow. And then more recently, we've been going through and doing a lot of work to identify the very specific details of what makes a good problem solver in science and engineering. What do they do? How do they do it? And developing much better, more effective ways of actually measuring how well students can or cannot, or how they have learned to do that.
And I want to add one point here is Carl is the Nobel Prize winner in physics, and he's also the professor at Stanford. I think we have had a very good start by having three of them giving us the wonderful self-introduction and also with the focus of the area they have been working on. So today, for the next 45 minutes, we'll be talking about a critical aspect of the learning and the teaching process, which is assessment. So the purpose for assessment is to help us to figure out what students know and don't know and figure out the best way to help them to reach their learning goals and objectives. So here, we probably have to talk a little bit more about education goals before we go deep dive, talk more about assessment. Nowadays, in the era of globalization in 21st century, we have this new upgraded kind of like education goals to help students become the critical thinker, creative learner, and also global participants. To better propel them to become the capable future global citizens, we not only need to teach them knowledge, but also there are so many competencies and skills we need to make sure they will be having. So my first question to my wonderful panelists is the following. What do you think are the critical competencies for our future global citizens? Anyone want to pick it up first?
Thank you. So I think we're obviously moving in at a time where specific skills are increasingly important to be successful at work. But we at ACT believe that we want to look at individuals what we call holistically, and that is to measure not only what you know but who you are as an individual. It was mentioned in one of the earlier sessions, the ability to learn. Right, I think it might have been your session, right? The notion that there are certain personality traits that I think we want to instill, especially in our younger students, and really try to understand and help them with what's really coming in terms of AI, machine learning, the kind of trends that we're seeing in the market today that are going to have a real impact on work in the future. And so how do you measure those kinds of skills? It's hard. It's not the same as measuring learning, measuring knowledge. But we really do believe that there needs to be a lot of focus, and ACT is doing a lot of research in the area of measuring these, what we call soft skills.
So I will follow up. I just want to make a small correction in my good friend Joy. Most tests are not actually used to help students learn. Most tests are to pick out students that gets them promoted, or they're for policymakers to make decisions. So most of our tests aren't actually designed to help students learn. But one thing that they all have in common is our tests sort of say what it is we value. And then everybody goes to that. So I think the thing we're going to be able to do in tests that we couldn't do before is measure the processes by which people learn and solve problems. So instead of measuring their discrete facts, their ability to solve well-designed problems that they've studied many times before, we're going to be able to look at things like, do they seek constructive criticism? Do they try multiple alternatives? Do they tolerate ambiguity? And so I think this is kind of where the future will be, but whether it will be in high-stakes tests, I don't know.
I will come up to that area a little bit later in my questions.
Thank you.
So to pick up on Dan's point, I mean, when he talks about, the tests aren't sort of to help students learn, it's important to realize that's only because that's the way they're used. They could be used to help students learn as well. And I think all three of us would advocate that ultimately a really good assessment not only can measure where students are, but it also can guide their future learning better as well. But getting back to the original question, I mean, the work that we've been doing is to think a lot about, what is it that people can do that a computer is never going to be able to do? And almost all current high-stakes testing, a computer could do just fine. They have to lock you up in a room so you can't go ask a computer because it already knows all those answers. And the reality is we don't, we don't need to hire people to do things that computers can do. And so in the studies we've been doing, it's kind of to looking at what is the thinking that people are capable of doing. And that means that sort of go beyond any of that, that is much more challenging. And how is it, what does it mean to say critical thinking? And so what we see is it's really about when faced with problems, when faced with ambiguity, making decisions about what information is relevant and needed and how to use that information. And so that goes back to the fact that having information isn't nearly as important as being able to think about why and how to use information, how to seek out information. And as we build a lot on Dan's work, he talks about being prepared for future learning. So when they do encounter information that is relevant, they'll be able to recognize and apply it. So those are the kind of key skills that I think the assessments really need to be looking at, and they are very different from what your traditional high-stakes tests actually measure. And
so if I were going to if I had the skills to make this kind of test, I think I would make it so that on all tests, students actually have to learn something during the test. So you might give them things to read, a portion of the internet that they can explore, and what you're trying to measure is, are they able to learn during the test, as opposed to measure what they already know from the past.
So we're actually making tests that do that. We have where the students have to first decide what information that they need, and then we provide them with that information either through an interactive simulation or a simple computer program that feeds them what information they've asked for. And then see what do they do with that information that they want, how do they use it, what conclusions can they draw from it. And it turns out those are really, really instructive things to measure.
So this is a take-home tip for when you go home and you see your child. Ask them, what would you like to know next to help solve a problem? And you'll really find out what it is they know and how they're thinking about it.
Well, it's really interesting to hear, actually Dan made a point about the current kind of assessment has like a lot of like problems, and you also mentioned some of the things we probably are working on, try to do a better job to assess the skills the students may have already acquired. So my next question.
So I just want to stress one thing that one always has to be thinking about with these kinds of assessments is so many assessments and goals have been set up, laid out very, very sensible goals, but what they end up with is driven by money. And the economics of assessment really drives things towards being very simple, very factual, and to large extent, very meaningless, and so one just can't talk about assessment in real terms without worrying about what's the economics driving behind this, unfortunately.
Yep, totally agree. And actually, I was going to ask you guys another question. So do you think the future of the assessment, like which will happen, maybe already have happened, will those new ways of assessments motivate the learner students in a better way than what we have done in the traditional assessment way?
Well, I think yes. I mean, I think, again, if you can develop assessments for learning as opposed to assessments of learning. So this notion of, high stakes or what we call summative tests versus the formative. And I think I do agree with my colleagues here that we are moving more towards formative. We're moving more towards trying to assess kind of embedded assessment, what we call stealth assessment. You don't even know that you're being assessed. But it's hard to do that in a paper and pencil context, right? And so when you're talking about assessing people at scale, and going back to the economics, because economics do play a role. As an individual who's been in testing for a number of years, you do have to take into account the fact that if you're going to test lots of people, it can be very expensive if you're doing kind of very, very high-end technology-based assessments. So we have to move towards a scenario where you've got a computer-based test that you can deliver at scale, but really provide that meaningful feedback to enhance the learning process and not just be kind of a summative at the end of course, end of year, end of high school type of assessment. Because I do believe that the future is moving away from those tests and more towards the formative tests.
So Joy, let me see if this would work for your question. So, you know, there's a lot of sort of like games for learning math. And you get a bunch of answers right, and you get points and maybe explosions on the screen, and you level up. So there's a game that every time you try to solve something a different way, it gives you points. Would that count as like motivating
I
learning?
think, yeah, that's a great example of motivating the learners. Yeah, thank you.
So it's possible.
Okay.
Good to know. And also, like Bob, you just mentioned something about a computer adaptive test. Actually, we also noticed technology has transformed assessment in many ways. Computer adaptive test has been mentioned many times. So if you can share with us what you guys have done, like ACT, you guys have done over there with this technology, and what are the results you guys have already seen there?
Well, we're fairly new to adaptive testing, right? So unlike ETS, which the GRE, which many of you might know is an adaptive high-stakes test, ACT only recently has begun looking at adaptive testing and beginning to kind of develop platforms so that we could deliver adaptive. We think that that is the future of our kinds of testing, the ability to adapt on the fly. If you think about, you know, adaptive testing in its kind of end state potentially should eliminate the need for a high-stakes test at the end. If you're assessing someone along the way in an adaptive context, by the time they get to the end of high school, you should know whether they have captured all the concepts required moving on. So that's the vision that we have. I think we're a number of years away from that, but I think that's where this is heading.
Actually, I have a question for Dan, without you raising up your hand.
Dan follow up
Yeah.
on this because
But
he's been working on it.
So
Go ahead,
let me, just so people understand what adaptive testing is, because it sounds great. Right, what adaptive testing is it's trying to figure out a way to find out faster what the kid knows. Right, so if the kid gets it wrong, it makes the problems easier, and the kid gets it right, it makes problems harder. So adaptive testing is just a way to shorten the amount of time that testing takes. I have yet to see an adaptive test that sort of says, this kid would learn better this way. Right, it's really just a standard test where you can speed it up. It's not looking at how people learn, right? It's just trying to find out what they know faster. So it's not that much magic. It's economically feasible.
But in terms of, I mean, there's another way to think about, I guess we need a different word from adaptive, but that's the things we're working on, which is a testing process in which different things happen in response to student actions. And so that's where they can seek information, and that it provides information. They can choose different approaches and so on, and pursue those. So there's a lot of things that are changing in the computer, but what's the right label?
Smart.
Yeah, maybe
Smart testing.
Smart, okay, fine.
Yeah, actually, I was going to direct my question to two professors here. Have we done any research regarding the adaptive test, like about how accurate and efficient it has been?
So, I mean, we haven't, I don't think either of us have done research on the adaptive testing. We're doing quite a lot, ongoing programs on these smart tests of what different things to have the computer ask, and different opportunities for students to go in different directions, and then from that understand better about the student thinking and where they are and how they could be helped.
So we have done where we have a technology where we can track the students and see how they're going about solving a problem. We can see they're making a mistake.
Okay.
The challenge is how to tell them what to do next. Right, so if we tell them you should do this, They don't learn very well. They just follow what you told them. It turns out our best solution was to tell them, you know, all the other kids are solving it this way. So I don't know if that's really good, but the point here is these kinds of tests that Carl and I'm talking about, the diagnosis is only half of it. The second half is now what do you do about it? And so I don't think we know a lot about that.
We you know, so some of the things that we know so recently, Dan doesn't know about it, does follow up on where they have something wrong. We then give them some sample solutions. We say, okay, here's 2 solutions that another student or 2 other students came up with, you know, and then evaluate those on the basis of what's right and wrong and good about them. And we see that actually has a lot of potential for them by seeing sort of alternative ways to think about it to help them actually adapt and adopt some of the better ways of thinking.
It seems like a lot of data need to be collected if you want to do it in the right way.
Yeah.
And I do see with the development of the technology, it is going to help us to develop more powerful, more comprehensive test system. Do you guys, have you guys seen like this kind of trend from the academia world and also from the industrial world?
So I'll chime in because we're working very much on this of trying to see what students answer. And I mean, so in our first round, we have these, you know, these smart platforms that change, and we're using, you know, then researchers carefully observing to evaluate. Now we're trying to say, okay, now that we've identified, you know, good and bad things and how to tell what students are thinking, how can we have a computer do that instead so that you can scale it up? And what we find is we look at lots and lots of claims for how artificial intelligence can be wonderful for this, and without going into a lot of technical details, artificial intelligence is not good for this. It works when you have 1 million people supposed to think the same way. This is each person's individual. But we do, and so we've been studying how to do it, and we find that, okay, computers aren't nearly smart enough by themselves, but if you put in a lot of researcher intelligence layered into guiding the computer, then it can become a much more effective way. And so just how good it can be, well, that's, you know, I'll call my student and see how it worked this week to see how much better. So we're moving there, but it's not an easy problem. And there's a lot more hype about it than actually demonstrated results that I've seen. So.
And earlier, Carl's presentation talked about problem solving. So one of the things that we're developing, so there's a group at ACT called ACT Next, which is kind of a next generation, you know, what is assessment going to look like in the next 3 to 5 years? And they've developed a kind of a gaming platform, which basically it's multiplayer gaming, and it's really there to build problem solving skills, measure problem solving, teamwork skills, multiple students working on one project together in a gaming environment. I think that, you know, the power of technology is to be able to deliver something like that. That's pretty exciting stuff, and there's a tremendous amount of data that can be captured as a result of those kinds of programs.
Do you have more points to add?
Of course.
Okay.
I'll think of something.
That's good. Yeah.
Oh, come on, you've got to talk with all kinds of stuff coming
So,
out of it.
So I think the challenge here is we actually, it's much easier to look at 2 + 2 = 4, and then 2 + 3 = 5, and you can make lots and lots of problems, and you can say exactly what's right and wrong. But in this world of strategies, I think it's much harder because the strategy doesn't always work. So it's not the right and wrong gets much harder to define. So I think what Carl's doing, where he's basically come up with 28 decision points, we sort of need to do that for everything. And I don't think it's there. So like creativity, I can think of 10 strategies and I can enumerate them. I think people need to do this for all of them, critical thinking and so on. And that's the bottleneck.
And we are, by the way, ACT is doing a creative thinking assessment for PISA this year. So again, the notion that creative thinking is important, let's try to figure out how to measure it, how to create this kind of you know, a very different approach to assessment. there's a lot of work going into it, but you're right, it's not where it needs to be.
But, one thing one needs to appreciate is how all of these things we're talking about are really very new concepts. And the fact that a lot of people are now thinking about it, and we clearly are making progress on it, is a pretty exciting change, really, in the whole landscape of assessment, I think.
Actually, we have talked about assessment for learners, students for quite some time. And also, I want to get some thoughts and ideas from you guys. Have we seen any improvements for the teacher's assessment so that educators will be able to come up with better learning solutions to help the students to achieve their learning goals?
So you mean evaluating the quality of teachers?
Yes.
So, I think I'm going to make a proposal that we sort of want teachers to be rated like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and if 5, they're great. I don't think that's the right direction. I think rather, I think the direction technology is going to take us is that we'll be able to help them on very discrete aspects of their practice. So, for example, there's a technology right now where you can put a cell phone in the classroom, and at the end of the day, the cell phone will tell you what percentage of the time did the teacher talk versus what percentage of the time did the students talk.
Will that information be helpful?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, when I start lecturing, I just talk and talk and talk, and I don't realize
Without noticing, yeah.
I don't realize it. And so to get this back, to realize, it'll also tell me which students in the classroom are talking. So it's sort of feedback for continual improvement. Rather than feedback for evaluation, it's feedback to allow the teacher to continually improve.
But will there be some kind of suggestions, like as the follow-up?
Don't talk so much.
Yeah. We're going to put in every class we have here with a giant clock showing how much time Dan's talked.
Your time's up. Yeah.
No. So I think when most people are talking about this are thinking about teaching at the K-12 level and sort of identifying certain things, I think I would argue, and people might disagree, but I would argue that at the university level, which is where I work at, we've identified really quite specific practices that consistently lead to better student outcomes. And so what we really need to be doing is measuring, how much to what extent a teacher is using the practices that research show result in better learning. And we need to be evaluating and rewarding teachers on that basis. So the reason I was sort of cringing when this question came up is for the last several years, I've been going around trying to persuade universities to switch from what universally is used as just these student evaluations. We have lots of data showing they have no relationship to the quality of learning and student outcomes. And so they're completely erroneous measurements, and trying to convince universities that, no, we just know something quite different about teaching now. There really are practices that matter, and that's what you should be using for evaluation. But it's a really slow, difficult process because it goes so much against the ancient traditions. But the capability is there right now, tomorrow, to do vastly better job of evaluating the competence of a university teacher.
It's interesting you just brought up one topic I really want us to have a deep dive discussion here, which is related to the college and university entrance assessment. So, of course, we have seen the education has changed quite a lot, and we've heard some high-stakes standardized exams are facing a lot of challenges. Maybe, Bob, you know more than we do. Why don't you first share with us what kind of challenges you guys are facing now?
Well, in the U.S., there's a pretty strong movement towards away from the college entrance exams.
So maybe you should explain a little bit about how entrance exams work in the U.S.
Sure.
compared to China, where
Sure.
it's a sort of single thing.
Right. Well, in the U.S., we have two, the ACT and the SAT, that are, primarily have been used for many, many years, 50, 60 years, as an admissions assessment. So college admissions officers look at the scores.
One of many things, though. It's not,
Well, it's one data point amongst many.
yeah, China,
like,
it's one.
right,
That's
right.
everything.
Gaokao is, I think, higher stakes than even those, because again, there are other determining factors in an admissions process, including grades and extracurricular activities and an essay, and there's a number of factors that go in. But even given that the college entrance exam score is only one of many things in the U.S., there's a fairly strong movement to kind of move away from it. Many colleges in the U.S. have opted out, which means they would not necessarily need to accept the score. As someone who's been in this, that's not a good thing for your business when colleges are saying it's not required anymore. But the gentleman from Stanford know, because in California right now there's a lawsuit that's basically trying to outlaw the SAT and the ACT because they believe it's discriminatory. We could spend the next 20 minutes talking about that particular issue.
We do have 20 minutes.
But needless to say, that would also not be good for business. If the college, state universities in California were not allowed to even use the test score, that's the kind of thing that could potentially happen across the country. What's interesting is that countries around the world are actually adopting these kinds of measures. So in Vietnam, for instance, they use the ACT as the exit exam for high school. So while the US is moving away, other markets and other countries are actually adopting these kind of standardized measures, which, again, we believe there's a good role for a standardized measure amongst the many other data points that admissions officers use, but it's a tough environment for the U.S. Market right now.
So you guys have anything you want to add on, like from the
wanna
university?
jump on that,
Jump on that. Like, they are facing a lot of challenges. So what do you guys want? Like, you guys have worked with tons of students from universities. When you guys accept them, probably you looked at their test score from ACT or SAT, and does that make some difference? Like higher score students, maybe they will do better. Is it really happening, or not much so?
So I think this may be, I may regret this statement. I don't think it really matters what kind of test you give. They're going to sort the kids pretty much the same. What I worry about is something called consequential validity, which is the test itself changes the system. So we put in tests, and suddenly all the schools are teaching to the test. And so that's the big concern for me. It's not, the test will always give you moderate to mild prediction of success in college. And I suspect whatever test it is, you will get the same thing. It's that if you have a test that's emphasizing certain kinds of abilities, that's what everybody will teach to. And so what we're learning is that people who teach to the current tests, when those students get into college, they have a very difficult time because they've been learning how to memorize, how to do very small procedural skills. They haven't been learning how to decide whether they actually understand something or not. And so this is what's at stake. It's what the test does to everybody in the world who teaches towards the test.
Carl, do you have?
that-
So
Drop the mic.
I think we all agree. Maybe only by giving only the scores, it means something, but it doesn't mean everything. So what are the other things you want the students to put on the plate and show to a college admission officer, help them to make the right judgment, who to accept, who not to be accepted?
Right. So I have some personal experience with this because I have an 18-year-old in high school who's currently in the application process. So we've been through many college admissions meetings, talking with college admissions officers about what they're looking for. And they all talk about holistic. They all talk about trying to understand the whole student, not just the test score, not just the grade point average, but the person. The essay, very important, just depicting who you are. Also extracurricular activities, the kind of things that you do outside of school are increasingly important.
But there are so many different kinds of like extracurriculums. Like how do they weigh them? Like sports versus like maybe music, other like activities?
So do you have a child you want to get in Stanford? Is that why you're asking?
I do. I have a 16-year-old one. Yes, that's why I'm asking this question.
Here's what I've been told. Sports, not so much. All right,
Really?
Unless you're a scholarship athlete. I'm sorry.
10% of the students at Stanford are competitive athletes
Right.
that have a significant higher chance of getting admitted because of that.
If you're at a high level, right? I want to make
National level,
it's a good-
probably.
right. If you were at a very high level and are kind of a scholarship, but if you're a good athlete in a school, but you're not, that's not your future. You're not going to be there to go to college and play sports. Then it doesn't have a lot of meaning. It's actually community service is what we hear constantly. Giving back, doing something, volunteering, those kinds of things I think are increasingly important. Again, I'm thinking from a U.S. perspective because that's my experience, but that's what we're hearing from the universities is, what are you doing for society? Are you thinking outside of yourself? Those are the kind of things that they're looking for.
So I'm going to, not having anything to do with the admissions, I'm going to take a contrarian view of this. I look at the students and they come in and take introductory physics. This is mostly not ones who are going to become physicists. They're going to go, it's a requirement for going into any area of engineering, which most of them, and areas of science. And I look at, what it is about those students that makes them successful or unsuccessful. And what's been very striking, really revolutionary for me, is to realize, so I spent 30 years at the University of Colorado, which is a large public research university, not very selective. If you're a Colorado student and you graduate from high school, you're almost guaranteed you can go to it. And comparing that with Stanford, which is the most selective institution in the United States now. And, once I start seeing those students in introductory physics class, they look an awful lot alike, It's really quite striking that, they're having trouble with the same things. They're making progress in very much the same ways. So I come back to look at this and say, that in some sense being successful as measured by taking these courses and allowing them to proceed through the major, all the admissions criteria are pretty meaningless. If you, no, I mean, if you've got these where they're being applied to the most extreme level, and the students that come in look just, are very hard to distinguish. Once they're in the environment of actually learning and the thinking about it, whatever admissions is looking at, it's not able to identify those much at all. So we see an enormous similarities between these two, what are supposed to be by admission standards, wildly different populations.
Jen, do you have a few points to add?
So Stanford's criteria is called intellectual vitality. Intellectual vitality. That's how it makes its admissions decisions. If you ask them exactly what that means, they will not tell you. because if they tell you, you will force your child to do every single thing on the list.
But, how meaningful what this intellectual vitality number is in terms of a person's future contributions to society, future success in, becoming a mechanical engineer, I bet it's little, if any, correlation.
Can I ask, is there a score associated with that? I mean,
We
I'm just curious, how they...
So you also have a child.
Yeah. Sorry, this is information we're not allowed to disclose. In fact, this is highly secret information, especially from university faculty, because they all have children.
So Dan, you probably should not have mentioned that.
So one thing that's useful to know, though, is all the information that comes in, there's also multiple people who look at it. So it's not just like the information comes in and then the key is turned. The information comes in and there's 5 to 6 people who looks at every single student.
Right.
and to see the degree to which they agree.
But, you know, ultimately what really matters is the capability of future learning. And I think one of the things this is we don't have tests currently, and we don't have all of these complicated admission things. I don't think any of these things are really doing a very good job at all of capturing that.
Well, it has been great discussion here. I still have some time. I will open to the floor and take some of your questions. If you raise up your hand, I will make sure someone of you can get you the microphone. The gentleman. Yeah.
Hi, professors and Bob. My name is Salil Pandey. I actually spent time in Palo Alto and New Delhi. I would like to go back to your question about like the tests, the admission criteria. And once you put them into the learning environment, it seems like they're pretty homogeneous. I think if you take them out of the learning environment and put them into the real life situation, they'll again go very diverse and heterogeneous. I faced this situation that when I was working for Schlumberger, we were all picked up from around the world, and the moment we went through the training program, we were all looking the same. But the moment you put them into a rig and there is a fire burning or there is some situation, everybody acts differently, behaves differently, and solves the problem differently. So just because they're in a similar learning environment and they're behaving pretty homogeneous, does that truly mean that admission, which is looking pretty deep into their background, has completely ignored all the aspects?
The kind of things I look at is how they're capable of doing, let's say, more authentic physics problems. So that's getting more towards an environment. So it's not wildly, you know, a completely different kind of situation, but it's certainly a reasonably authentic use of the knowledge of what they're learning in those courses. And that's what I would say is probably not so different. If you're going to...
And if you guys can say the question in English, it will be much convenient for them to understand. We don't need to do extra translation. Can I get that gentleman standing at the back? You, yes, yeah, yes, yeah.
That's my only bit of Chinese. I just want to take this quickly in the direction of John Hattie. Hope you're familiar with him, Invisible Learning, and use a sentence from him, which is that the most powerful effects in learning are seen when learners become their own teachers. And what I'm referring us back to there is the power of self-assessment and the ability of students to begin to learn more about their own thinking processes and then develop metacognition. I don't want to use too many jargons, but that's what it's normally called. Are we anywhere near a piece of AI that's going to support that process? An algorithm, an app that we can put in the hands of learners around the world where they can explore the power of their own self-assessment and their own learning potential.
I can talk about this, please.
So this idea of, you know, metacognition, or I'd call it reflective learning, so we focus particularly on reflective problem solving, but that's, as Dan points out, an important point of problem solving is learning along the way, so they're very closely linked. And the answer is, we're not about to give you an app, but I think we can give you, I mean, we've run experiments and tests, and we're now actually scaling this up to the Stanford Medical School courses of building in activities that we believe will make people much more reflective problem solvers and reflection on their strategies. And, you know, stay posted. In another couple months, we'll actually have the data from this larger scale, but we have, you know, laboratory studies and one small course study showing, yeah, you can teach these things to students pretty well if you just directly focus on regularly having them step back and reflect on what their answers were, what their strategies for finding those answers, and how they can improve that. And that's a regular part of the instructional activities, or the, you know, educational activities that they're completing in a course.
So if I can just follow up on that. So observing your own learning is like one of the hardest things in the world. So how do I know if I've learned? All the other students in class are changing with me, so I can't look at them. I can't look at the teacher or professor because they know so much more. So what do is I look at the test, right? And so that test suddenly tells me whether I've learned or not. So this is a tough one. How can you get people? My guess is this is what a good college is for, right? It's to help you be able to decide what does it mean to have understood to a sufficient degree. But this is a very hard problem.
But, I mean, there is a lot of value in social interaction in this, where people, opportunities for, having things where they fail, but also they take different approaches and they talk through different strategies and evaluate the advantages and disadvantages of different strategies that the students may have pursued.
Just to follow up on that. So my son, before he was going to take a test, he'd always tell me, I'm going to get an A on this test. And then he would take the test and he'd come back and he'd tell me, I'm going to get an A on this test. And then he would come back and he'd get a D. And this happened, a D is low. So this happened over and over and over. He was unable to tell. So what did he do? He finally figured out to be part of a social group. And then by talking to other people, he began to be able to see where he was in his own thinking.
But I bet that was in his high school, not higher education, right?
I don't know what happened in higher education.
I mean,
it was expensive.
It certainly, but I mean, I mean, we see in science it happens much more readily, actually, in higher education often.
Where's the microphone?
Boy, big crowd back there.
Hi, excuse me. Is there any research or progress being done or being made as far as just a metric for learning? I mean, you measure everything, obviously, length in feet or meters or something, but we still don't have a good metric, right? We have seat time, and even the Carnegie Foundation says that the Carnegie unit is outdated and a bad thing for the world, right? So is there any of the research that you all are doing or the ACT as far as just, other than ACT as a score, any other metric for how much you've learned in a semester or a month or a day?
Nothing I would know of.
No, so the problem with that, I mean, it's a nice idea. The challenge is, let's say it turns out the number of synapses you grow. That would be the metric. It's so abstract, it doesn't give you any guidance on what to do next. So you need kind of a specificity that's at the level that you could do something about. So the goal of having an IQ measure for learning may not be the right one.
Where's the microphone? There's people over at the side there. And people in back, oh, well, okay.
Can we pass the microphone?
Yeah, get the microphone.
I think probably we can take 2 more questions. Yeah. The lady over there.
Hi, you touched bases about a lot of colleges and universities in the U.S. They get away with ACT and SAT. So, and also as a lot of the top boarding schools, day schools, they don't offer AP anymore. So my question is, what's going to be replaced to really evaluate mostly international students? Because in the U.S., it's more, standard, state, private school, and, they all have a profile. But for instance, in China, it's a different, government school, private school, international school. So how are you going to evaluate international students, which account for maybe 15, 20% of the population in the university? So maybe you can share your thought. Thank you.
Well, there's, I know the ACT is not available here in China, right? So there are some limitations in terms of using a score like that. I think there's been some talk about even maybe using the Gaokao as a potential. Again, what's happening in the U.S., unlike selective universities like Stanford, which obviously have no difficulty in recruiting students, there are many, many universities in the United States that actually are in need of filling their classes every year. And so international students become a really important component of that class. And so my sense is they're being very innovative about how they recruit and assess those students. For instance, in the English language market, we know the TOEFL and IELTS are very standard English language assessments, but there's a company you may be familiar called Duolingo. And Duolingo essentially is an English language, it's a language app, and they've created a $40 test to disrupt the market. And Stanford, I believe, actually accepts the Duolingo test today as a measure of English proficiency. So there are ways of kind of accessing those markets, but it's hard. It's getting increasingly difficult, I think. But it's not like there's no shortage of demand in the U.S. for good students from China and other markets.
I can take one last question from the audience. I pick this young lady here.
Hi, thank you for sharing. I have a question related to what Dan mentioned about like consequential validity, because like for most of the assessment are served to measure where the students are, right? But the real situations do not go like what we expect them to do, because usually people start to teach to meet the requirement of the assessment, and students time are filled with all the practices to pass the exam, and instead of really enjoy the education process and own their education experience. So with the technology development, and I'm glad to hear that, and also the teaching methods are different, and Carl mentioned in the morning that has a huge effect on students' learning and understanding. Yeah, so with the technology development, do you think we can expect that there will be different kind of assessment that can actually, not just track the dynamics of the personal development and students' understanding, but also embedded elements that actually boost students' agency and invite them to the decision making and explore their learning experience? That's my question for you guys.
So we're out of time. I think it's a great idea.
And
Good luck. I think it's a good idea.
We're doing that in some of the some of the developments we have for teaching, both now in the medicine and teaching introductory physics. We're actually building those things into the instructional activities and the way the courses run.
I think we probably, especially these three wonderful panelists, they have more to share with you, but unfortunately, the time is up. So we have to wrap up this session. I hope you have enjoyed this panel discussion as much as I do. Let's give them another big round of applause for their sharing. Thank you, gentlemen.